I started the climb just as the storm line formed over the Appalachian ridge. The air had that heavy, waiting quality, like the mountain was holding its breath. Snow softened everything. The parking lot, the tree line, even the sound of my boots grinding through the first drifts. By the time I reached the high trailhead, the world felt padded, muted, sealed off from whatever lived below. For hours, I moved steadily upward, expecting the usual mountain sounds. Wind threading through branches, a distant woodpecker, maybe the groan of shifting ice. But nothing greeted me. Not a single chirp or rustle. Just the rhythm of my breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. Even that seemed swallowed too quickly, as if the ridge didn't want echoes. As the light thinned toward dusk, a crack snapped across the mountainside. It sounded heavy, too heavy to be just ice shearing off a ledge, the kind of impact you feel in your ribs. I stood there with the cold settling into my clothes, listening for another. None came. The silence afterward felt deeper. I pitched my tent just below the crest, pressed into a shallow hollow for wind cover. The storm clouds thickened above me, dragging the early night down by several hours. I lay inside my sleeping bag, headlamp off, listening to the thin fabric of the tent shift with each passing gust. Then something brushed against the wall, not the jittery tremble of wind, not stray snow sliding off the fly. A deliberate stroke, light, testing, moving along the side closest to my head. The fabric trembled under it, and for a moment, I couldn't bray. I waited for the touch to return. It never did, but the silence that followed felt even more attentive than before. Morning came without color. The sky above the ridge was a flat sheet of gray, the kind that gave away nothing. No temperature shift, no hint of the storm's next move. I crawled out of the tent expecting a simple snowfall or the usual scatter of branches blown down in the night. Instead, I saw the drag marks. They carved through the powder just a few feet down slope, long grooves in the snow that ran parallel for 10, maybe 12 yards, before vanishing into a stand of dark pines. Not fresh enough to still shed loose crystals, but not old either. Whatever made them had moved sometime after I'd fallen asleep. The strange part wasn't the shape or the depth. It was the way the lines swayed slightly, as if whatever had been pulled, or had pulled itself, wasn't moving in a straight line. Almost like it twisted or reeled as it slid. I followed the tracks for a few steps before something in my gut tugged me back. The trees at the end of the marks felt wrong. Still, watching, the way animals go silent when a predator is near. I backed away and breathed into my gloves, letting the fog from my mouth rise like steam off the snow. I told myself it was just fallen debris dragged by wind overnight. But the pattern was too clean, too intentional. The climb that day took me deeper into the white vastness above the tree line. By mid-morning, the wind had returned, not fierce but steady, and I welcomed the noise of it. After the silence of the previous day, even a harsh gust felt normal, but normal didn't last. The wind shifted as I ascended a narrow saddle. It wasn't the direction that bothered me, it was the tone. Low at first, like the distant rumble of an approaching avalanche. Then stretched, elongated, shaped into something that felt too structured to be random. A long, guttural vibration rolled through the air, caught in the channel between ridges. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, then another, slightly different. Higher, not words, not quite, but not wind either. I stopped on the ridge and felt the hair rise under my layers. I'd heard strange acoustics in mountains before, rock faces echoing, snowfields swallowing and bending sound. But this was different. This had cadence, rise and fall, like something trying to form syllables through a throat not built for it. I pulled out my phone despite the cold and hit record. The sound came again, threading through the gusts like a moan too controlled to be accidental. When I played it back a minute later, all I heard was static, faint crackling, irregular pops, and under it a thumping. Not steady enough to be footsteps, not mechanical enough to be interference, more like something striking the ground at intervals, far away but heavy. I replayed it 3 times, though each listen made the unease climb higher in my chest. I didn't keep the recording. I deleted it. I couldn't explain why, just that some part of me didn't want that sound saved anywhere. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened again, and the wind line dropped lower on the ridge, threading through the rocks with sharper, wetter notes. Clouds gathered like bruises, stacked in layers that seemed to crush the horizon. I decided to stop early and set up camp before the storm trapped me in the open. Once the tent was up and anchored, I sat inside with my headlamp off, listening to the mountain's shifting breaths. Snow ticked against the fabric. Ice popped under the stakes. The wind grew restless, swirling in pockets that pressed and released against the nylon in slow waves. For a moment, everything fell into an eerie calm, the kind right before thunder hits. Then came the footsteps. Not running, not stumbling. A slow, deliberate pacing that circled the tent in a wide arc. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Each step measured, as though whoever, or whatever, made them wanted me to hear, to track each movement. The sound moved behind my head, then drifted toward the front, pausing where the zipper lay. I held my breath so long it burned in my chest. The steps continued another half circle, and then stopped completely. No retreating sound, no fading crunch through snow, just gone. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm building outside. My ears strained for anything, another step, a breath, even the wind to start up again. But the mountain held perfectly still, like it was waiting. I lay there in the dark, the cold creeping in around the seams of the tent, and realized the truth I'd been dodging since the first night. I wasn't alone on the ridge, and whatever shared it with me knew exactly where I slept. Morning came with a thin, metallic light, gray, sharp, almost surgical as it slipped across the snow. I stepped out of the tent expecting to see nothing but the remnants of wind-scoured drifts. Instead, the world had been rewritten overnight. Just a few feet from where I slept, a trail of footprints sank so deeply into the snow that the edges formed crisp, icy walls. They were broad, far broader than any boot print I'd ever seen, each one spaced with a distance that made my stomach tighten. Whatever had walked there moved with a stride twice the length of a grown man. I crouched beside the nearest impression and placed my glove over it. My whole hand fit inside with room to spare. I checked for other signs, claw marks, dragged edges, signs of melting, distortions from wind. Nothing explained it. Nothing was normal. The trail led uphill, toward the ridge's edge where the snow was thinner, swept clean by the gusts the night before. Logic should have told me that any trace would have been filled in by morning. But the prints continued with perfect clarity, as if they'd been pressed just moments before I woke. The sunlight seemed almost afraid to touch them. Each step held a depth that suggested weight far heavier than human, yet the surrounding snow remained untouched. No collapse, no radiating cracks. Just those impressions, too wide, too deep, too spaced apart. I felt the cold climb higher up my spine than the air temperature could justify, the kind of chill that comes from understanding something before you want to admit it. I followed the trail until it reached a narrow lip of the ridge. The prints simply stopped there. No turn, no stagger, no hint of where the creature had gone. It was as if it had walked straight into the open air. The drop beyond was vertical, a sheer face of ice and rock plunging into a wooded ravine. Nothing could have cleared it without slipping or leaving some sign, yet the snow on the ledge was undisturbed. I leaned closer, gripping a rock for balance, but the void below offered nothing in return. It felt like staring into a held breath. When I backed away, something else caught my attention. My own boot prints from the night before. They weren't right. They looked smudged, dragged slightly outward, as though something had brushed over them with quiet purpose. Even deep into the ridge, far above any hikers or animals, someone, or something, had altered my tracks. I felt a pulse of heat in my chest, anger first, fear second. I didn't like the idea of being watched, and I liked even less the thought of being followed. I tried convincing myself the wind had done it, but the pattern was too uniform, too deliberate. As if fingers had traced them. When I returned to camp, I noticed the snow around my tent had changed. Not much, just enough that the surface seemed subtly disturbed, as though something heavy had stood there, shifting its weight from side to side. I knelt, brushing away a thin layer of powder. Beneath it, beside one of the tent stakes, lay a single massive print. It was deeper than the rest, pressed into compacted ice with such force that the indentation shimmered with tiny fractures. My breath fogged over it, frosting the edges. I didn't touch it. I didn't even finish brushing it clear. I simply stared and tried to convince myself that panic wasn't the right reaction. But the truth seeped in anyway. Something had stood inches from where I slept. Not just passing by, not just circling in the dark, standing, watching. Testing the ground beside my shelter like it was choosing the best angle. The wind shifted, carrying the faint hiss of loose snow sliding across the ridge. The sound echoed differently now, hollow, almost reverent, as if the mountain itself understood the significance of what I'd found. I packed slowly, deliberately, trying not to look over my shoulder as I worked. Every small noise, a groan in the ice, a whistle through the tent poles, felt targeted, timed, aware. I told myself to stay calm, to continue the ascent, to trust my experience. But even as I prepared to move higher, my eyes kept drifting back to that enormous print beside the tent stake. It felt like a message left in a language I wasn't meant to understand. A warning, or maybe a promise, pressed into the frozen ground. And as I turned uphill, the ridge seemed to listen, waiting to see what I would do next. By the time I reached my next stopping point, the sky had sunk into a dim, oppressive gray. The ridge loomed like a frozen spine above me, and every gust of wind seemed to slip deeper beneath my layers than the last. I set my pack down beside a slanted outcrop, grateful for even the slightest break in the wind. I planned to melt snow, warm my hands, regain a sense of normalcy before the push higher. But when I knelt beside my stove, the breath left my chest in a slow, stunned exhale. The metal casing was bent inward like someone had gripped it in both hands and twisted. The fuel line hung slack, snapped cleanly near the valve. It didn't look stepped on, it didn't look dropped, it looked crushed, as if immense pressure had been applied with calm, deliberate force. I reached out but didn't touch it. Even through my gloves I could imagine the cold impression of whatever hands, or claws, had done this. Where the stove should have been, something else sat waiting. A spiral, precise, intentional. Dark feathers arranged in a perfect coil, each one angled toward a single object in the center. A tooth, long, curved, the size of my thumb, its surface polished to a dull brown sheen. It didn't belong to anything I recognized. Not deer, not bear. Nothing that should have been on this ridge. especially in winter. I felt the cold seep into me as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The wind was no longer the source of the chill. I stood slowly and scanned the ridge. The storm clouds thickened above, dragging sheets of white across the slopes. Visibility shrank. Landmarks disappeared. Shadows formed where no rock or tree should have been. They didn't move with the storm. They shifted in ways that had nothing to do with wind or light, as if something behind the whiteout was pacing, following, adjusting its distance while keeping just enough veil. With the temperature plummeting and night approaching, I retreated to the tent, the fabric snapping lightly as the gale built strength. Inside, the air felt tight, thin. The ridge had grown silent again, an unnatural, coiled silence that pressed against the nylon like a second skin. I kept my headlamp off and waited for my breathing to steady. My thoughts drifted to the twisted stove, the spiral of feathers, the tooth, all arranged as if placed there for me to find. A message I couldn't decipher. Then came the sound. Soft at first, a faint rustle against the tent wall. I told myself it was the wind, a stray clump of snow sliding from the fly, but the noise came again, closer this time, brushing right along the panel beside my shoulder. A slow drag, not frantic, not accidental. Something intentional moving with purpose, feeling the contour of the tent like it was mapping it. I froze, breath caught halfway between lungs and lips. The fabric indented slightly inward, just enough for the shape of it to register in the dark. Not a paw, not the wide press of a human hand. Something elongated. Fingers, maybe, or something like them. The rustling shifted to the front of the tent. A faint sniffing, wet and deep, drew a cold line down my spine. It wasn't the quick inhale of an animal. It was slower. A drawn-out examination, as if pulling the scent through a long, narrow throat. The exhale that followed rasped so close it vibrated the thin nylon between us. A dry, hollow sound, like air passing over broken reeds. I didn't move, didn't even blink. The cold inside the tent grew heavier, denser, with each breath of whatever stood on the other side. Time stretched thin, elastic, until I wasn't sure if seconds or minutes had passed. The storm outside howled, but the space around the tent remained unnervingly quiet, an island of stillness in the midst of the chaos. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sniffing stopped. No footsteps retreated, no crunch of snow, just absence, an emptiness more disturbing than the presence itself. I waited long after the cold had settled back into its natural place, listening for the slightest hint that the thing still lingered. But nothing came. Only the wind rose again, moving through the ridge as if covering for whatever had visited me. I lay there knowing one thing with absolute clarity. The ridge wasn't just watching me now. It had started touching the world around me, rearranging it, replacing pieces of my life with pieces of its own. And it wasn't done. By morning, the storm had settled into a steady, low moan that followed me up the ridge like a tired animal. The air tasted metallic, as if lightning had kissed the snow sometime in the night. I forced myself higher, toward the summit cabin I'd seen marked on the old maps, half hoping it still stood, half hoping the storm would hide it forever. Every step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the growing sense that leaving camp hadn't put distance between me and whatever prowled the ridge. If anything, the feeling grew stronger the farther I climbed. It didn't take long for the first item to go missing. A glove, my left one, had disappeared from the outer pocket of my pack. In its place, nestled neatly where the glove should have been, lay a pebble. Smooth. Wet with something darker than melted snow. A smear of red clung to one edge, as though whatever left it had handled it carelessly. I stared at the pebble too long, the wind scraping against my hood like fingers tapping fabric. I told myself the glove must have fallen somewhere behind me, but that didn't explain the stone, or the blood. An hour later, a food pouch was missing. In its place, a tuft of coarse, matted fur that smelled faintly of copper. Another hour, another loss. A coil of rope replaced with something that looked disturbingly like a strip of hide. I didn't inspect it too closely. I couldn't. Each exchange felt more deliberate, as though the ridge was in the process of trading pieces of my survival for pieces of itself. Like it was negotiating, studying, rewriting the inventory of my existence. The higher I climbed, the stranger the wind became. It no longer moved randomly across the ridge. It patterned itself, breathing in a rhythm that matched mine with unsettling accuracy. 3 long breaths. A pause, 3 more. I didn't notice at first. But by the time I reached the narrow traverse below the summit lip, the syncopation had become impossible to ignore. Every exhale I made returned to me moments later, carried by gusts that twisted through the rocks and came back sounding just slightly different, as if the ridge were practicing my breath, repeating it until it became its own. Eventually, I stopped to rest on a ledge carved into the slope. Snow drifted across my boots in thin, restless sheets. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I looked left, then right, taking in the landscape that had once felt vast and open. The storm blurred everything into indistinct shapes, but something about the pattern of the shadows made my skin tighten. No matter where I turned, a single figure seemed to be standing at the far edge of visibility, always the same distance away, always the same height. At first, I told myself it was a boulder, just a trick of the storm, but when I shifted position, the shape shifted too, maintaining its distance while staying within the same angle of my vision. When I pivoted the other way, it reappeared again, not moving closer, not retreating, just waiting, watching. The consistency was impossible. Nature didn't behave like that. Storms didn't hold their silhouettes in place. Shadows didn't track you with perfect discipline. I felt it then, the sensation of being triangulated, as if invisible lines were drawn from the ridge to me and back again, as though whatever shared this mountain with me had long since mapped my route, my breath, my tempo, my fear. My life felt reduced to a single point in a much larger pattern I wasn't meant to decipher. I didn't move for a long time. The wind breathed its 3-count rhythm behind me. The shape stood at its chosen distance, patient and constant. Snow continued to fall, covering my boots up to the ankles. For the first time since arriving on the ridge, I had the sense that climbing or descending made no difference. Direction meant nothing to something that could appear in every direction at once. When I finally took a step forward, the wind paused, just a fraction of a second, barely enough to notice. But it paused, as if acknowledging the decision, as if waiting to see what I would do next. By dusk, the storm had reached its full violence. It didn't fall from the sky. It tore downward in sheets, the wind driving each flake like shards of glass. The ridge transformed into a narrow white corridor, the world collapsing into a tunnel only a few feet wide. Every step felt like wading blindfolded into a river. Snow hammered against my hood with a relentless force, and the sound of it built into a steady roar that made my heartbeat feel thin and distant. I pushed forward, focusing on the faint incline beneath my boots, telling myself that the summit had to be close. The maps showed the cabin just above this stretch. Shelter. A door I could shut. A barrier between me and whatever had been shadowing me since the first night. But the storm swallowed every landmark. Even the ground seemed to shift beneath me, softening and hardening without pattern. The ridge no longer felt like stone. It felt alive, flexing under the weight of wind and cold. Then the gusts broke. Only for a heartbeat, but enough for the mountain to exhale something else. Above me, at the crest of the ridge, a silhouette took shape. A human, not an animal, something larger. Wider at the shoulders than any creature had a right to be. It stood against the sky like a vertical slash in the blizzard, a black cut in the white. The storm didn't seem to hit it. The snow curved around it, redirected, warped, as though the thing displaced more than just space. When the next gust hit, the figure vanished into the chaos, but not in the way a person disappears behind blowing snow. It didn't step away, it didn't retreat, it folded. The outline bent at angles that made no biological sense, shifting into itself like shadows sliding across each other. I blinked, certain I'd imagined it, then it reappeared closer, not walking, not climbing, descending in short, jerking motions, each movement too quick and too stiff to be natural. Between each break in the storm, I caught glimpses. A long torso, limbs too elongated, shoulders brushing the rocky edges of the ridge as if testing their give. The air seemed to darken around it, not because of the storm, but because the thing brought its own absence of light. I staggered backward, boots slipping, breath cutting short. The wind ripped sideways and the blizzard swallowed the creature again, but its presence lingered in the pressure of the air, in the faint tremor underfoot, in the sharp metallic scent rolling down the slope. I didn't think, I just turned and ran. The storm resisted me like a physical force, the gusts slamming into my chest, turning each step into a slow-motion struggle. My lungs burned from the cold, and the slope beneath me felt more like shifting sand than ice. I could barely see my hands in front of me. Then the mountain answered. A deep bellow tore through the blizzard, vibrating through the snowpack, through the rocks, through the hollow of my ribs. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a call. It was the sound of something enormous announcing itself, something older than the ridge, older than the storm, older than anything that should have been moving through that night. The force of it shook loose clumps of snow from the tree line below. Branches shuddered violently, some snapping with sharp cracks that echoed through the corridor of white. The blizzard seemed to hesitate, as if the storm itself recoiled from the noise. I slipped, dropped to my knees, and caught myself with my hands plunged wrist-deep into the cold. The ground trembled again, a slow, rhythmic pulse that suggested footsteps descending the slope behind me. Heavy enough to shake snow free, heavy enough to register through layers of ice. I tried to rise, but the cold had stiffened my muscles. My legs responded sluggishly, as if my body were already accepting a fate my mind refused to acknowledge. I forced myself up anyway, pushing into the wind with clumsy determination. Behind me, the mountain groaned. Another bellow rippled through the storm, closer this time, much closer. Snow cascaded from the pines in sheets. A branch snapped. Another followed. Something massive was moving downhill, carving its own path, indifferent to the terrain, indifferent to me. The sound chased me in pulses, each one more urgent than the last. I didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to see it, part of me did, but because some instinct deeper than fear told me that looking would be the same as offering myself. As soon as I reached the next bend of the ridge, I felt the presence behind me swell, pressing into the space I'd just occupied. The storm swallowed me whole, but the thing in it was closing the gap, and the ridge, once indifferent, now seemed eager to deliver me into its waiting arms. The storm swallowed the ridge so completely The direction stopped meaning anything. The slope I thought I was descending felt wrong beneath my boots. Too smooth in some places, too soft in others, as if the mountain were reshaping itself under the wind. My vision blurred with snow until up and down blurred into the same endless white. The bellow behind me had faded, but the silence it left was worse. It felt poised, studying, waiting for me to make the next mistake. I dropped to all fours without thinking. Instinct, maybe, or desperation. On my hands and knees, the wind hit me with less force, and the slope felt more readable. I chose what I hoped was downhill and began crawling, my gloves carving shallow trenches through the powder. The cold soaked through them almost immediately, numbing my fingers, but crawling at least offered a rhythm, something to hold on to as the mountain tried to erase every trace of path or logic. Time dissolved. Minutes or hours passed. I couldn't tell. The storm distorted sound, making it impossible to judge distance. Sometimes I heard a creak or a groan that felt close enough to touch. Other times a deep vibration rolled under the snow, like something moving parallel to me beneath the surface. Not fast, not hunting, just mirroring my pace, step for step, crawl for crawl. When I finally pulled myself upright, the landscape had changed again. No slope, no trees. Just a wide, open plateau dusted with fresh snow that looked untouched, smooth as frost on glass. My own tracks behind me stretched only a few feet before fading into nothing. I didn't understand how that was possible. I'd been crawling for what felt like miles, but the wind had erased everything except what it wanted me to see. Then I spotted it. Off to my right, half buried in a drift, a torn scrap of fabric. My fabric, the same scrap I'd lost hours earlier when a piece of my jacket ripped on an exposed branch. The same scrap I'd passed once already, and once before that. A small, soft panic crept up the back of my throat. I told myself it had blown across the ridge ahead of me, carried by the wind, but the snow around it was undisturbed, as if it had been placed there gently, positioned, waiting for me to find it again. I kept moving, forcing myself not to look directly at the dark shapes the storm suggested in my periphery. Each step felt heavier, my muscles lagging behind my thoughts. The cold had burrowed deep into my bones, and with it came a strange sense of detachment, as if the wind were tugging loose pieces of my awareness one by one. Then I saw the prints, huge, wide, deep enough to expose the ice beneath the snow. They appeared ahead of me in a staggered pattern I recognized instantly. The same monstrous tracks I'd seen by my tent. Only these were fresher, sharper around the edges. Whatever made them had passed through moments ago, or it was still nearby, hidden in the storm's folds. I tried to veer away from them, but no matter which direction I chose, the storm shifted, revealing another set waiting on the path ahead. Some overlapped my own footprints. Others seemed to anticipate where I was going, curving gently toward where my next steps would fall. It felt like walking inside a diagram drawn by something that already knew the ending. The roar came suddenly, ripping through the whiteout so close that the snow beneath me quivered. I dropped instinctively, arms covering my head, waiting for the weight of something enormous to crash down. But nothing touched me. The sound rolled past, echoing across the plateau, as if the storm had opened a vast, hollow space behind me. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in sharp, uneven bursts. The wind died for a single moment, just long enough for me to hear the soft shifting of snow behind me. A slow displacement, a deliberate repositioning. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. The air itself tilted, heavy with the presence I'd felt circling me since the first night. Then the roar came again, closer this time, So close I felt the vibration push through my back and into my ribs. It ripped the warmth from my lungs and launched me into a blind, staggering sprint. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. My body simply moved, driven by a single, primal instinct: distance. Behind me, the ridge groaned under something immense. Ahead of me, the storm opened like a mouth, and I ran straight into it, hoping the mountain would give me one more chance to escape its endless loop. When I opened my eyes again, the world was blurry and warm. Too warm for the ridge, too warm for snow. A slow, rhythmic beeping tugged me upward through a fog I couldn't remember entering. It took several long breaths before the shapes around me resolved into the interior of a ranger station infirmary. A cot beneath me. A thin blanket over my chest. The soft weight of bandages around my hands and legs. For a moment, I thought the storm had followed me inside, because every sound still carried that distant, hollow quality, as if I were hearing it through layers of wind. A ranger sat nearby, saying something about exposure, frostbite, days missing. His voice felt muffled at the edges, like the mountains still clung to my ears. I tried asking how I'd gotten there, but the words tangled, and my throat burned with each attempt. Eventually, he told me they'd found me collapsed at the tree line below the base trail, half-conscious, clothes shredded, snow packed into the fabric as if I'd crawled miles. No tracks around me, no sign of a descent, just me alone in a clearing that hadn't shown footprints in any direction. When they brought out the map, my stomach tightened. I traced the line I believed I'd followed, downhill, desperate, certain I'd been fleeing straight toward safety. But the ranger shook his head and pointed to a plateau much higher on the ridge, a flat, barren shelf carved into the mountain. My starting point. Every direction I'd run, north, south, east, west, led back to that same featureless place. No matter which way I turned, the mountain had spun me in circles, drawing tighter each time. I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly, but a quiet recognition, like I'd always known the ridge wasn't a place you escaped simply by moving your feet. Later, when they returned my gear, their careful expressions told me something was wrong before they spoke. My coat was laid across a table, flattened as if prepared for examination. The fabric was torn in long, clean arcs. Too clean for branches, too uneven for knives. Embedded near the shoulder seam was a feather I didn't remember seeing. Oily, mottled, longer than my forearm. The barbs clung together like they'd been wet with something thicker than snowmelt. The rangers assumed it belonged to some large bird, maybe an eagle caught in the same storm, but even as they said it, none of them seemed convinced. The feather didn't look like it belonged to anything that flew. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. They discharged me the next morning, insisting I get checked again at a proper hospital. The sun glowed weakly through thin clouds as I stepped outside, the snow around the station turning slushy under its weight. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over, that I'd left whatever haunted the ridge behind me, trapped in its storm. Sealed above the tree line like a bad dream preserved in ice. Then I looked down, just a few inches from the station door, pressed deep into the melting slush, sat a single print, wide, heavy. The same shape I'd found beside my tent stake. Snowmelt pooled in its center, making it glisten like something still fresh. No other marks surrounded it. No trail leading to or away from the station. Just one footprint waiting for me to find it. The air around me cooled, as if the ridge had exhaled across the valley. I stepped back without meaning to, heart thudding in a slow, uneven rhythm. The rangers didn't notice. No one noticed. But I knew, I felt it in the hollow of my chest. in the ache deep beneath my frost-bitten skin. The ridge had not let me go. It had simply followed. And somewhere beyond the tree line, hidden by distance and daylight, something stood still enough to watch me see its mark. It knew where to find me now. The Goatman's Hollow. The valley opened before them like a mouth swallowed whole by mountains, steep ridges folding over each other until sunlight barely touched the ground. The hikers stepped cautiously, boots crunching against loose stones, and the air felt heavier. Each breath seemed thick with weight, as if the atmosphere itself had grown dense, almost viscous, pressing against their lungs. The wind carried nothing but silence, except for the faint murmur of a creek too far to see. Their GPS flickered suddenly, the screen stuttering, then blanking entirely. Numbers replaced by empty spaces, coordinates gone, as if the hollow had erased itself from every system. One hiker tapped the screen, pressing buttons in vain. The device refused to respond. Compasses spun briefly before snapping back, unreliable. Even the sun felt uncertain, its angle distorting slightly against the sky. Something about this place wasn't right, small anomalies that refused explanation. A bleat sounded, somewhere between near and impossibly far. Not a deer, not a goat, not anything they recognized. It echoed through the valley in irregular pulses, bouncing off ridges and cliffs, disorienting in its timing. Another bleat followed, and then a third, overlapping like an odd chorus. The hikers froze. There was no path, no animal track, nothing that could account for the sound, but it persisted, constant, unnerving, almost waiting for them to respond. As they set their first marker, a small flag tied to a sapling, the flag itself turned. Slowly, deliberately, it spun in a direction opposite to the path they had intended. They exchanged uneasy glances. At first, it seemed like wind or an uneven branch, but the forest was still. Leaves hung motionless, and not a bird stirred. It was subtle, a minor thing, yet it carried a weight they could not ignore. They had entered a place that refused their maps, their tools, their assumptions of the world. The sun lowered quickly behind the ridges, and shadows stretched long and strange. Each step deeper into the hollow made the air feel warmer, like the forest itself exhaled, as though it were alive and breathing around them. The bleats returned intermittently, too measured to be natural, their origins impossible to pinpoint. Every hiker felt it, the sensation of being watched from multiple angles at once, of space bending in imperceptible ways. The ground beneath their boots, the trunks around them, even the air itself seemed to shift subtly when no one was looking. They continued, forced forward by momentum, curiosity, and the stubborn pride of explorers. Each marker placed seemed to resist them. Flags drooped, rocks rolled slightly, compasses flickered, as if the hollow itself had opinions about their intrusion. Every sound, every movement, every pattern felt manipulated. The valley was a living puzzle, and they were only beginning to understand how little control they had. As twilight fell, the bleating coalesced into a rhythm, echoing between ridges, impossible to locate. It was both close enough to smell and distant enough to disorient, and each note lingered unnervingly long, like the hollow was marking them, counting them, warning them. When they stopped to rest, the markers pointed again in directions that made no sense, creating a subtle labyrinth that drew them inward, into the shadows of the valley that refused to exist on any map. By the time darkness fully descended, the air had thickened to a suffocating stillness. The forest around them felt patient, deliberate, waiting. The bleating ceased for a moment, leaving an emptiness far heavier than any noise could be. And the hikers, once confident in their bearings, now understood that the hollow had begun its work. It did not simply exist, it reshaped reality around them, folding time and space, bending their perceptions and waiting to see if they would notice. The valley was not just a place, it was a presence, and it had noticed them. The deeper they moved into the hollow, the forest seemed to change under their feet. What had once been soft, untouched moss now bore deep impressions, hoof-shaped and too large to belong to any deer they had ever seen. Each print pressed unnaturally into the soil, as if something heavy had descended deliberately, pausing to mark its presence. One hiker knelt, running a hand along the depressions, feeling the vibration of something alive beneath the earth, a rhythm that pulsed with the warmth of a body just out of reach. The forest no longer felt passive. It exhaled around them, the air thickening with every step, each breath weighed down by an unseen, pressing awareness. Movement flickered at the edge of their vision. A rustle behind a tree, too deliberate to be wind. One of the hikers spun toward it, heart hammering, only to find emptiness. But emptiness was never the same here. The shadows shifted, curling at impossible angles. As if the forest itself had rearranged to keep secrets, even their own footprints seemed to bend backward, disturbed and reshaped by forces they could not name. They exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the hollow was not merely unfamiliar terrain, but a place that obeyed no rules, where perception and reality could no longer be trusted. When they set up camp, the unease only intensified. Lanterns lit small circles of light, but beyond them, darkness seemed to pulse, alive with expectation. They noticed new tracks surrounding the campsite, fresh, deep, circling twice, then fading into the underbrush. No wind, no animal movement, yet the prints existed, precise and deliberate. Every hiker felt the sensation of being measured, catalogued, as though invisible eyes traced their every motion. The forest's breathing grew heavier, each inhalation stirring leaves and moss with a deliberate, patient rhythm. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the lantern light, elongating and bending against the contours of trees. At times, the shapes between trunks seemed to pause in mid-motion, as if aware they were being watched in return. A low, almost inaudible vibration ran through the ground when the hiker stepped near one cluster of prints, subtle enough to dismiss, yet enough to make him hesitate. Unsteady, heart thudding against ribs. The warmth in the soil beneath the moss suggested a presence hiding beneath, something large, patient, and almost impossibly aware of them. By nightfall, the forest had fully transformed into an alien landscape. Every sound, from the creak of branches to the distant call of birds long gone from this valley, seemed orchestrated. The hikers' senses betrayed them. One swore a figure moved behind a tree, then blinked and saw only the silent trunk. Yet the prints multiplied, subtle at first, then unmistakable, marking the perimeter of their camp with an insistence that left no doubt they were not alone. The hollow was closing around them, patient, intelligent, bending the ground, the air, the space between trees, until even familiar landmarks no longer meant safety. When they finally tried to rest, the oppressive awareness never let up. The deep hoof prints, the warmth beneath the moss, the subtle shifting of shadows. It all suggested something watching from below and beyond, calculating, circling, patient. Every hiker lay awake, hearing faint whispers in the rustle of leaves, imagining movement where there should be none, and feeling the pressure of a presence that was not quite human, yet disturbingly aware of their every heartbeat. The hollow was alive, waiting, and with every passing hour it became more certain that it intended to claim them, bending the forest in their perception until escape itself became a question without answer. As the hikers pressed deeper into the hollow, the canopy thickened with sudden, unnatural density, blotting out sunlight and plunging the forest floor into an eerie, permanent twilight. The temperature dropped, and a damp chill settled on their skin, though the air still felt unnervingly heavy, as if the forest itself exhaled over them. The usual symphony of birds and insects had vanished, replaced by a haunting stillness that carried a subtle, almost musical vibration. Then came the whispers. At first, they were nearly imperceptible, threaded through the breeze, soft syllables that sounded both animal and human. Names, drawn out in half-formed murmurs, echoed from branches and hollow trunks. One hiker paused, heart pounding, certain he had heard his own name called from behind a twisted oak. When he spun around, nothing was there. The shadows themselves seemed to quiver slightly, as though the forest had taken on the form of an unseen audience, observing, waiting. Every movement, every snapping twig or rustling leaf felt amplified, deliberate, and yet impossibly ambiguous in source. Radios, which had so far been used only for practical communication, began crackling with static. At first, it was harmless, a soft hiss that accompanied the whispers. But then the sound warped, warbling into tones that resembled voices speaking directly to them. One hiker froze as he heard a warped imitation of his own voice, repeating the last words he had spoken, twisted and distorted, echoing unnaturally through the forest. Panic began to gnaw at them. Every attempt to call back yielded only more distortion, a feedback loop of impossible speech that seemed to originate from everywhere at once. The forest responded to their fear. The path ahead, which had seemed clear moments before, now felt labyrinthine, the trees subtly rearranged, their trunks spaced differently, roots rising where none had been. Shadows lengthened and swayed independently of light, stretching across the hiker's vision like dark fingers. One hiker insisted he saw movement, a flicker of something stepping lightly behind a tree, yet when the group turned, the figure dissolved into nothing. The hollow itself was bending perception, warping space as it gathered awareness of the intruders. Suddenly, a tree fell nearby with no warning, no sound of cracking wood in advance, scattering the hikers in startled silence. The impact reverberated through the earth, yet the fallen trunk showed no evidence of human or animal intervention. Dust rose slowly, settling like fine mist, and when it cleared, the forest had shifted again. Marks on the ground were rearranged. Impressions in the soil that had been footprints or hoofprints were subtly altered, loops forming that led nowhere. Each subtle disruption whispered the same message. The hollow was alive, and it was shaping their reality to confound them. The whispers grew louder and more insistent as night approached. Names continued to echo through the trees, sometimes from two directions at once, sometimes trailing them like a shadow. The forest seemed to breathe in synchrony with their rising panic, its pulse reflected in the rustling leaves, in the vibration beneath their feet, in the way shadows seemed to watch from angles that should not exist. One hiker tried to steady his breathing, attempting rational explanations, but each step forward revealed more irregularities. Moss-covered roots lifted impossibly, the ground itself forming undulations that resembled the shape of bodies crouched beneath the soil. As darkness descended fully, the forest became suffocating. Every whisper now seemed purposeful, every static crackle a warning, every branch that snapped a punctuation in a sentence they could not understand. They huddled together, unable to discern the edges of the hollow, the distance between trees warped and inconsistent, and every attempt to orient themselves failed. Their radios continued to mimic them, warping human voices into distorted, almost mocking versions of themselves. By the time they gathered near a small clearing to regroup, the full weight of the hollow's intent pressed down. The whispers threaded through the wind, the warped voices taunting and anticipating, the forest's shadows writhing and bending at impossible angles. They realized that the hollow did not simply surround them, it owned them, manipulating perception, threading fear into every sound, every movement, and every heartbeat. They had entered a place that did not obey the rules of the natural world, a valley that was patient, deliberate, and aware, and it was only beginning to reveal what it demanded of those who dared step within. Darkness arrived faster than expected, swallowing the hikers' camp in minutes, as though the hollow itself had pulled a curtain across the sky. The lanterns they had set flickered weakly, casting pools of light that barely penetrated the oppressive shadows. Shapes moved just beyond the glow, pacing silently, mirroring their movements with a patience that sent shivers through every spine. The air seemed to thicken with the presence of something unseen, something that waited and watched, shifting imperceptibly whenever their gaze attempted to catch it. One hiker froze as he glimpsed a figure kneeling just beyond the tents. Horned, impossibly tall, its eyes glinting in the lantern light, it remained motionless for a heartbeat, as if studying them before sinking into the shadows again. Every branch scrape, every rustle of leaves carried a deliberate rhythm, too precise to be the wind. Their own breathing seemed amplified, each inhale a signal to the unseen observer. The forest had changed from passive witness to active participant, calculating and patient, a predator folding the night around them. Suddenly, a lantern burst, its flame extinguished with a soft pop, plunging part of the camp into darkness. In that instant, movement rushed past, something large and fluid, alternating between 2 and 4 legs, brushing against the tents before disappearing into the black. Panic seized the hikers. The boundaries between solid forms and shadows blurred, and the hollow itself seemed to warp around their perception. The earth beneath their feet no longer felt stable, the moss and leaf litter shifting subtly with the weight of something hidden just beyond visibility. Every step they took was mirrored, every movement anticipated. Branches bent as they approached, forming unnatural angles, and shadows stretched longer than physics should allow. The subtle rhythm of hoofbeats, irregular, deliberate, almost human, echoed through the hollow, disorienting them further. The air carried a faint metallic tang, as if iron had been dragged across stone, mingling with the earthy scent of pine and wet soil. Fear was no longer a reaction. It had become a constant, pressing presence, pressing the edges of their consciousness into sharp awareness. In the dim light of remaining lanterns, one hiker noticed the ground surrounding their tents. Footprints and clawed impressions formed in circles, overlapping and shifting, appearing where none had been moments before. The hollow had begun to manipulate not just the environment, but time itself, compressing moments, rearranging the physical space, leaving them to question every step they had taken. Whispers threaded through the air once more, half animal, half human, echoing from multiple directions at once. Names were called, sometimes in the distorted voice of one of their own, threading panic through the group like a tangible cord. Movement in the shadows continued relentlessly. Branches scraped tents in rhythm with their panicked breaths. Leaves shifted as though something large paced just beyond view. And the rustling of the undergrowth suggested simultaneous approach and retreat. One hiker, eyes wide, thought he saw a horned figure leaning over the nearest tent, head cocked unnaturally, limbs bending at impossible angles. When he blinked, the figure vanished, leaving only darkness and the pounding of his own heartbeat echoing in the hollow. By the time the group attempted to regroup, the forest had transformed completely. The tree line warped subtly, creating corridors that seemed familiar yet impossible, looping back upon themselves. The whispers grew louder, almost impatient, mingling with a chorus of footsteps that could not belong to any human or known creature. Every instinct screamed that the hollow had begun to claim them, testing their reactions, shaping their reality with a slow, deliberate cruelty. The night was no longer a backdrop, it was an active predator, stalking, circling, leaning closer. As hours dragged on, exhaustion met terror. The hikers huddled near the remaining light, eyes straining, minds unraveling under the persistent, patient pressure of the hollow. Shapes paced just beyond sight, waiting for them to look away, to stumble, to breathe wrong. They could feel the presence pressing against them, both outside the tents and somehow within their own awareness, threading into thought and perception. When one of the hikers dared to peek into the shadows, the darkness seemed to recoil and then surge forward, confirming the unmistakable truth. The hollow was alive, deliberate, and far closer than they could comprehend. By the fifth night, exhaustion had merged with terror, and the forest around the hikers had grown almost sentient, pressing in on every side. Shadows were no longer static, they moved independently, stretching unnaturally, bending over trunks and rocks in ways that made the forest feel as if it were breathing. Each hiker began to notice distortions. Friends standing where they shouldn't, limbs bending at impossible angles, figures looming in the corners of vision only to vanish when confronted. The hollow was no longer just a place, it was a force, threading perception and reality into something unrecognizable. Whispers grew more deliberate. Voices, half human, half animal, called names from multiple directions at once, mocking, coaxing, demanding attention. One hiker froze as a warped imitation of his own voice echoed from both sides, creating a loop of sound that seemed to coil around the camp. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the moment they moved, the hollow redirected them. Paths that should have led away twisted back upon themselves, and the familiar markers of the forest were gone. Every attempt at orientation became a trap, leading them in circles until panic overtook rational thought. Their camp became a cage. Lanterns flickered in defiance of the windless night, casting fractured light across the warped ground. The forest seemed to pulse with anticipation, every leaf and root vibrating subtly underfoot, communicating a patient, deliberate presence. Hoofprints and clawed impressions appeared around them, fresh and impossibly close, marking the passage of something unseen. The air carried a faint metallic scent, sharp and iron-like, mingling with the damp musk of pine and earth, filling their nostrils with a taste of danger they could not place. Hallucinations became indistinguishable from reality. Figures stood where friends should have been, mirroring their motions with uncanny precision, only to stretch and distort into forms that were almost human, but grotesque in proportion. The forest was reshaping itself around their perception, bending space so that even leaving the campsite became impossible. One hiker, turning to check on a companion, discovered the friend already staring at him from the wrong angle, their features subtly twisted, mouth forming words that weren't spoken. Fear became a constant pressure, threading into the marrow of their bones, impossible to shake. When they finally attempted to retreat, the hollow refused them passage. Trails that should have led toward safety folded back, looping upon themselves in impossible geometry. Every attempt to orient by compass or stars failed. Even the moonlight seemed uncertain, casting shadows that contradicted the angles of the terrain. The hollow had absorbed their presence, bending reality into a corridor of terror from which there was no escape. Each step forward was met with subtle resistance. A branch shifted, a rock rolled, shadows congealed, always just enough to force them back toward the center, toward the camp that was no longer a refuge but the epicenter of the hollow's awareness. Night deepened, and the forest's consciousness seemed to tighten around them. Eyes, hollow, unblinking, unplaceable, glimmered at the edges of sight. Some appeared to float, others perched in trees, all observing, waiting, measuring. Every glance revealed more impossible forms, elongated limbs, crouched torsos, shapes that could not exist in the physical world. They were always just out of reach, teasing the mind with glimpses that left a lingering sense of exposure, vulnerability, and the realization that the forest's intelligence was deliberate and predatory. By the time they realized the night would never fully end, the group was fractured, minds fraying under the constant pressure of impossible perception. They ran, blindly, following routes that should have led out, but only returned them to the campsite. Warmth still clung to the tents as though time had looped back upon itself. The hollow had claimed the ground, folded the space, and tested them beyond endurance. They were no longer hikers in a forest. They were subjects in a patient experiment, measured by unseen forces, manipulated by every shadow, every sound, every whisper that the hollow breathed into existence. The realization settled like ice in their veins. Escape was no longer a choice. They were trapped, observed, and the forest had learned their rhythm, their fear, their names. Each hiker now existed within the hollow's perception, a part of its geometry, its loops, its whispers, and its unblinking eyes. The forest watched and waited, patient beyond comprehension, and the shadows leaned closer, promising that no step, no breath, and no heartbeat would ever be free from its gaze. By the time they realized the forest had begun to physically manipulate their surroundings, panic had fully taken hold. Ridgelines no longer matched the maps in their heads, trails folded into themselves, and familiar trees appeared in impossible arrangements. Every attempt to retrace their steps or escape led only deeper into the hollow, looping back to locations they had already passed, as if the forest had memorized their every movement and was now mocking them. The air was thick, almost viscous, carrying the faint metallic tang of soil turned by claws or hooves unseen. Each breath felt borrowed, as though they were inhaling the hollow itself. A sudden scream split the unnatural silence. One hiker had vanished into the brush, his voice torn between terror and disbelief. The others sprinted toward him, calling his name, but the forest answered only with a distortion of their own cries, looping, twisting, mocking. When they reached the spot where he had disappeared, all that remained was his pack, shredded and torn, snagged high among the twisted branches of a tree. Deep claw marks scored the bark, indicating weight and strength far beyond any ordinary animal. The hollow was no longer a passive observer. It had begun to reach out, to claim, to mark its presence in physical terms they could no longer deny. Every step thereafter was tentative, each footfall measured against unseen threats. The hollow pressed in from all sides. Shadows deepened unnaturally, stretching and leaning as if they were solid forms, stretching to meet the hikers no matter which way they turned. Trees rearranged subtly as they moved, roots and trunks appearing where they had not been moments before, reshaping space in a way that defied logic. The hikers stumbled repeatedly, only to find themselves back at their own campsite, tents still warm from hours earlier. Despite the elapsed time, the forest had folded their path, creating loops and dead ends that felt intentional, calculated, almost intelligent. As desperation mounted, they ran blindly, following the vaguest sense of direction. Every clearing revealed fresh impressions in the soil, deep hoofprints, clawed marks, and trails that circled back in impossible configurations. The earth itself seemed to breathe, pulsing beneath their feet with a rhythm that matched their pounding hearts. One hiker, collapsing against a tree, noticed dozens of fresh hoofprints converging on their location from every direction, leading toward them like predators surrounding prey. There was no escape, only the certainty that the hollow had anticipated every move, and the forest's awareness was far older and far more patient than they could comprehend. The air grew warmer, heavier, and the shadows more distinct. Figures, tall, narrow, and jointed in ways that made limbs bend impossibly, skirted the edges of their vision. They moved silently, pacing, circling, always just beyond reach, yet leaving traces that confirmed their presence. Disturbed moss, faint scratches on bark, the subtle dip of the ground as if enormous bodies crouched unseen. Each hiker could feel eyes on their backs even when they dared not turn, and the forest itself seemed to pulse in synchrony with those unblinking, observing gazes. The hollow had ceased to be a place. It had become an entity, patient, deliberate, and aware. Time collapsed. Daylight that should have emerged remained muted, filtered through the dense canopy, leaving everything in the dim glow of perpetual twilight. Every sense was heightened, every sound amplified, the soft snapping of twigs, the subtle shifts in moss, the faint exhalation of air from unseen throats. The hikers realized with a sinking dread that the forest was testing them, cataloging them, measuring the limits of fear and endurance. They were no longer in control. They were part of the hollow's rhythm, objects within its geometry of terror. As they reached another clearing, the horrifying scale of the hollow became undeniable. The ground was marked by dozens of fresh hoofprints converging from every direction, circling in patterns that implied an intelligence and deliberation behind them. The forest seemed to lean inward, every tree, every shadow, every whisper conspiring to disorient, trap, and terrify. The hikers were running through a maze that shifted beneath their feet, a labyrinth designed by an unseen, calculating force. Every heartbeat echoed against the hollow, and every breath was monitored by entities that were simultaneously there and not, human and impossible, patient beyond comprehension. In that moment, the forest made one thing clear: it could bend paths, reshape landscapes, and erase any hope of escape. The hollow was not just watching, they were inside it, and it had already begun to claim them. By the time the first hints of dawn brushed the sky, the hollow had claimed almost everything. Only one hiker remained conscious, staggering through the undergrowth, dragging a dying flashlight that barely pierced the dim gray of pre-light. The air was thick with a metallic tang, mixed with the earthy scent of disturbed soil and crushed pine needles, clinging to skin and clothing. Exhaustion gnawed at every muscle. Yet fear drove movement, forcing one foot ahead of the other in a rhythm dictated not by survival, but by the hollow's relentless patience. The forest seemed quieter now, but that was only because the horrors had shifted into focus. Tall, narrow silhouettes emerged at the edge of the clearing, pacing along the tree line. Their forms were unnatural, jointed in ways that defied anatomy, limbs bending in impossible angles, torsos elongated, heads horned, eyes glinting in the dim light. They moved with deliberate cadence, circling and observing, their presence heavy and almost tactile, pressing against the hiker's mind as much as the air around them. Every step the survivor took was measured, mirrored, anticipated. The hollow had orchestrated this moment, compressing hours of terror into a confrontation whose inevitability weighed like stone. One silhouette broke formation, stepping closer, each motion precise, almost ceremonial, its elongated legs bent at two distinct joints, giving it a rhythm that was both fluid and disturbing. The eyes, impossibly wide, dark and unblinking, locked on the hiker, who stumbled backward, breath ragged, muscles screaming from exhaustion. The hollow's silence amplified the pounding of their own heartbeat, each thump a signal, a warning, a countdown. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet no path existed. The forest itself seemed to lean, shifting ever so subtly to redirect them, corralling the survivor toward the edge of the clearing where the silhouettes waited. The surviving hiker lifted the camera slung at their side, desperate for some proof, some evidence, some distraction. The lens captured what eyes could not fully comprehend. The shapes pressed against the tree line, impossible in scale and form, each figure maintaining a silent, predatory patience. They were humanoid enough to evoke recognition, animal enough to trigger primal fear, and their stillness was almost unbearable. As the shutter clicked, the air seemed to thrum with a low vibration, and the ground beneath the hikers' feet shifted subtly, reminding them of the hollow's omnipresence. Panic surged. The flashlight flickered violently, casting fractured beams across the figures, revealing glimpses of skin stretched unnaturally, antler-like projections catching the last faint light. Shapes lurched closer, soundless, and the survivors staggered backward, each step met by branches that seemed to shift to block escape. Even as they ran, the silhouettes anticipated movement, pacing methodically, never hurried, never chaotic, embodying the hollow's patience and intelligence. The forest itself had become an extension of the entities, its soil and roots conspiring to entrap, its shadows shaping perception into corridors of terror. The hiker's lungs burned, legs trembling, yet the clearing offered no reprieve. Every attempt to turn, to run into a gap, revealed the same silhouettes, sometimes in different positions, sometimes multiplied, always watching, always waiting. The hollow had folded space, compressed time, and manipulated perception so completely that there was no difference between what was real and what was conjured by terror. Each heartbeat resonated with the silhouette's unblinking gaze, and every step carried the certainty that the hollow's entities had planned this culmination long before the hikers had arrived. Then came the scream. Low, guttural, almost human, yet undeniably alien. It tore through the clearing with a resonance that shook leaves, soil, and mind alike. The hiker bolted, stumbling through undergrowth, dragging the dying flashlight as the figures did not chase but simply observed, their forms a reminder that escape was no longer an option. They had been measured, counted, and marked. The scream lingered, echoing through ridges and trees, embedding itself in consciousness, a signal of dominance, of completion, of the hollow's absolute control. By the time sunlight fully pierced the tree line, the clearing was empty of life, except for the lone survivor, shaking, breathless, camera clutched like a talisman. The silhouettes had receded, yet their presence lingered in the shadows, in the distorted impressions of the soil, and in the trembling consciousness of the hiker. The hollow had demonstrated its patience, its intelligence, and its incomprehensible power. The survivor moved forward, aware that nothing in this forest was left untouched, nothing safe, and that the horned shapes at dawn's edge had left a permanent, haunting mark on both the land and their mind. The survivor stumbled from the hollow at first light, collapsing near a service road as though the act of leaving had burned every ounce of strength from their body. The forest behind them remained silent, deceptively calm, as if the horrors within had never existed. But the survivor knew otherwise. The loops of trails, the shifting trees, and the whispered voices that had called their name left impressions far deeper than any physical mark. Every instinct screamed that the hollow had not released them completely, that it had claimed a portion of their mind, leaving an imprint that would linger forever. Authorities arrived hours later, drawn by the survivors' frantic reports. Words failed to capture the unnatural geometry of the hollow, the circular hoof prints, the clawed tree marks high above the ground, or the distorted movement of shadows. Maps and GPS readings told one story. Nothing unusual existed here. Yet the survivor insisted, voice breaking, that the hollow was alive, deliberate, aware, and unending. Photos taken from their camera were reviewed, each frame an attempt to document evidence of the impossible. At first glance, the woods appeared empty, the underbrush undisturbed, the sunlight falling in neat, expected patterns. But in the corners of images, between trees, forms lurked. Tall, narrow silhouettes bent at unnatural angles, eyes glinting in shadows that should not exist. One photograph showed a clear path through the hollow, lined with trees perfectly aligned for perception. Yet, in the background, a towering figure pressed against the trunks, jointed limbs folding unnaturally, as if observing the photographer rather than simply standing. Another captured a cluster of hoof-shaped impressions forming a circle, fresh, deep, and far too precise to be natural, surrounding a patch of moss that had seemed undisturbed when visited. Every image contained anomalies, subtle yet undeniable, each frame hinting at something more sinister than could be explained by logic or fear. The survivor pored over the film, shaking, unable to reconcile what their eyes had captured with what they had experienced. The hollow had twisted reality, erased paths, manipulated shadows, and warped time, and yet it had left evidence behind in these photographs, proof of its presence and its patient, intelligent cruelty. Some images revealed forms closer than any could have been, hovering near the edges of tents or pacing the tree line, their presence almost imperceptible, yet undeniably real. Each frame teased the boundary between what was seen and what was imagined, leaving an indelible impression that the hollow's reach extended far beyond comprehension. Authorities could not explain the discrepancies. The woods were ordinary on every measurable level, yet the photos told another story, a story of an entity that observed, manipulated, and waited. The survivors' trembling hands clutched the camera, a silent testimony to what they had endured. In some frames, one could almost feel the gaze of the horned, jointed figures pressing through the lens, an awareness embedded in the image itself, waiting for recognition. The hollow had left markers, witnesses of its intelligence, its patience, and its calculated cruelty, visible only to those who dared to look closely enough to see. As the survivor recovered physically, the psychological aftershocks persisted. Dreams were haunted by the hollow's geometry, trails looping impossibly, shadows bending, and the whispers of voices, half human, half animal, calling from unreachable corners. The photographs, once meant to document wildlife, now served as windows into a reality that should not exist, a forest alive with intelligence, patient and deliberate, observing and recording every step of those who trespassed. The hollow's presence lingered, unseen but undeniable, in the edges of perception, in every reflection of the mind, and in the unmistakable awareness that its reach extended far beyond the physical forest. The final photograph, the one the survivor dared not show anyone for long, was the most disturbing. It depicted the clearing where the hiker had staggered at dawn's edge. In the frame, a figure loomed directly behind the survivor, obscured in shadow but unmistakable in form. elongated limbs bent impossibly, antler-like projections arching skyward, eyes glinting as if aware of the camera, aware of them. The survivors swore nothing had been there when they turned, yet the image confirmed that the hollow had followed, had observed, had lingered beyond the limits of perception. It remained patient, deliberate, and ever present, a reminder that some places do not release those who enter, and some horrors are recorded long after the witness has fled. Whispering Pines. She had returned to the overgrown paths of her childhood camp, seeking fragments of memory, small tokens of summers long past, unaware that the forest itself had changed in her absence. The tall pines swayed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, casting shadows that stretched and shifted like dark fingers across the undergrowth. Each step on the moss-covered trail sounded unusually loud, her boots pressing into the damp earth with echoes that seemed to linger longer than possible. The air smelled of pine and decay, sharp yet familiar, a scent that teased the edges of memory while carrying the faint tang of something metallic, like iron left out in the rain. The cabins appeared at first glance intact, weathered but untouched, standing stubbornly among the trees as if guarding secrets. Yet there was something unnervingly still about them. Windows reflected the forest in unnatural angles, catching glimpses of movement that did not match the tree's sway. Doors hung slightly off their hinges, as if nudged by invisible hands, and the silence that pressed around her felt almost deliberate, a waiting that tightened with every footfall. Even the wind seemed to obey its own rhythm, shifting the branches with whispered intention, brushing against her ears with hints of speech she could not understand. A faint whisper threaded through the pines, brushing against her consciousness like a caress and a warning all at once. It was barely audible, a teasing fragment of sound that rose and fell with the sigh of the forest. She paused, straining to hear, but the whisper dissipated as quickly as it arrived, leaving her heart thundering in the sudden quiet. The trail ahead twisted into familiar turns, yet every bend seemed different, subtly wrong, like a memory folded over itself. The forest no longer felt like a space she could navigate. It felt alive, aware, and patient, waiting to see what she would do next. Each step forward amplified the tension. Twigs snapped underfoot, but the echoes carried strangely, lingering longer than physics should allow, stretching the distance between action and reaction. Shadows shifted in the corner of her eye, pulling at her attention even when she forced herself to look elsewhere. The cabins, once places of safety and warmth, seemed to watch, their worn exteriors hiding something beneath the wood and paint, something that had learned to wait. Even the creek that had once murmured softly in the background now whispered like a chorus of voices, subtle and fractured, threading through the stillness with indistinct phrases that made her pause and question her own hearing. As dusk fell, the forest grew heavier, darker, folding around her. The tall pines became pillars of an unbroken cathedral, their silhouettes stretching like dark sentinels, bending perception with their silent presence. The whisper returned, closer now, curling through the branches and brushing against her shoulder as though a finger had traced the line of her spine. Her pulse quickened, heartbeats echoing like drumbeats in a hollow chamber, and a creeping sense of being observed settled over her. She was alone, yet not alone. The forest carried attention, deliberate and unblinking, that threaded into her awareness with every step. By the time she reached the first cluster of cabins, the air seemed to vibrate with expectation. The doors, once sturdy and welcoming, now hung unevenly, and the windows reflected glimpses of movement she could not place. Shapes crouching just beyond the light, almost human but impossibly warped, vanishing when she blinked. The forest whispered in loops, drawing her deeper into the camp, nudging her toward places she had long thought familiar, but that now seemed foreign. Each step was measured against unseen eyes, and each shadow held the possibility of something waiting, patient, and far closer than she wanted to believe. She realized, slowly, that returning to the camp had not been a simple journey down memory lane. The forest was aware of her presence, alive in ways she could not fully comprehend, and every rustle, every sway of pine, every whispered fragment carried meaning. Something in the hollow of the pines was learning her, marking her, waiting, and she could not yet see what it intended. She stepped cautiously among the familiar cabins, each one weathered by time, yet carrying an unsettling sense of deliberate rearrangement. Doors hung slightly ajar, as if nudged by unseen hands, and windows were shattered in jagged patterns, reflecting the forest in fractured, impossible angles. Inside, the remnants of camp life were displaced, subtle at first. A chair moved a few inches. A faded sleeping bag turned the wrong way. But with each passing cabin, the alterations grew more pronounced. Objects she remembered clearly from her childhood now seemed deliberately repositioned, arranged in ways that defied reason, as if someone or something had been rehearsing their presence for her arrival. Shadows clung to corners and crevices, darting when her gaze fell elsewhere, fleeting shapes that vanished the moment she turned. They moved with intent, skimming across walls, pooling along the floorboards, stretching unnaturally toward the light, and then dissipating into the half-light of the forest beyond. Her own footsteps felt magnified, echoing against the wooden structures with a hollow resonance that made her pause more than once. The sense of being watched had begun as a flicker in the back of her mind, but was now undeniable. Each rustle, each creak, carried a weight of attention that pressed against her awareness like an unseen hand. The wind, if it could even be called wind, whispered through broken windows, threading fragmented sounds into her consciousness. A soft clatter of a displaced mug, the subtle sliding of a chair across floorboards, the faint scrape of wood against wood, it all hinted at movement when nothing was visible. She could feel the presence of something hovering just beyond perception, attentive, patient, and waiting for her to make the next mistake. Each cabin seemed to pulse with quiet anticipation, the air thickened by the invisible gaze of whatever had learned to occupy the spaces she once considered safe. Her eyes caught a subtle repetition. Objects in one cabin reflected those in another, arranged in symmetry that was almost obsessive, almost ritualistic. The forest had spilled into the camp, reshaping memory, challenging her recollection of what should have been familiar. She realized with a tightening chest that the cabins themselves had become active participants, not just shelters but sentinels, silent witnesses to her movements, complicit in whatever game the forest now played. Every glance over a shoulder revealed empty doorways that seemed just slightly wrong, shadows that leaned closer than they should have, forms that flickered at the edge of vision before dissolving entirely. Outside, the forest pressed against the cabins, and the whispering grew more insistent, threading through broken window panes and around splintered door frames. Shapes moved through the underbrush, deliberate in their pacing, stopping whenever she looked directly, yet resuming when her gaze drifted. Every footstep she took seemed catalogued, measured, and mirrored. The air carried a faint metallic tang, subtle but persistent, mixing with the scent of pine and decaying wood, an invisible signature left behind by whatever lingered in the hollow. By the time she moved through the final cabin in the row, the sense of being enclosed by attention was suffocating. Shadows clung to her heels, darting just out of reach, and whispers teased her from multiple directions, layering in unintelligible patterns that mimicked words she almost recognized. Her name, fragments of phrases, calls that seemed familiar yet alien. She tried to reassure herself that she was alone, but the evidence of displaced objects, shattered windows, and fleeting shapes argued otherwise. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet the forest and its altered cabins had begun to enforce their presence. The air was thick with anticipation, and she felt the invisible gaze of something patient and deliberate. The camp was no longer merely abandoned. It had become a maze of observation, a labyrinth designed to watch, test, and ensnare anyone who dared return. Every step forward carried with it the certainty that she was being studied, measured, and slowly absorbed into the forest's quiet, unyielding claim. The whispers began as subtle murmurs, barely audible above the rustle of the tall pines, yet each one carried a familiarity that tightened her chest. They threaded through the dense trees like a current, rising and falling in tones that almost resembled words, sometimes even her own name. Every breeze seemed purposeful, each sway of the branches carrying fragments of sound she could not place. A faint syllable, a breath that seemed to mimic her own, a low murmur that vanished when she strained to listen. The forest, once a backdrop to her childhood memories, had become a listening organism, attuned to her presence and patient in its observation. Her steps slowed as she followed the trails deeper into the camp, every footfall crunching against the undergrowth with exaggerated resonance. The pines pressed closer, shadows lengthening unnaturally, weaving through one another to form shapes that seemed almost humanoid. Every rustle of leaves, every subtle snap of a twig felt intentional, choreographed to keep her alert and off balance. The forest's attention was relentless, circling, studying, adapting to her movements in a way that made the familiar paths impossible to trust. Even the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, soft soil compressing under invisible weight, then springing back as though echoing footsteps that were not her own. She noticed faint footprints pressed into the dirt, too small, too delicate to be human, winding between cabins and across open clearings. They appeared suddenly and without origin, weaving around stumps, leaping over fallen logs, vanishing into shadows that should have been empty. Each impression unnerved her more than the last, a silent message that she was not alone. When she glanced back, the forest appeared undisturbed, the pines swaying gently as though nothing had passed. Yet the tracks remained, marking a presence that was patient, deliberate, and impossibly close. In one of the cabins she discovered a diary, brittle with age and stained with something dark, almost like sap, but far more unsettling. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, and in places incomprehensible, alien in its cadence, looping letters into symbols that defied logic. Pages described the disappearance of children long ago, their names recorded with meticulous care, alongside cryptic warnings and observations. The more she read, the more the whispers outside seemed to respond, rising and falling in tempo with the scrawled words. It was as if the forest itself was reciting from the diary, a living echo of forgotten horrors, carrying the terror forward through both time and space. The pines closed around her as night approached, the fading light casting shifting shadows that pooled in corners and between trunks. The whispers intensified, overlapping now, forming layers of sound that were almost intelligible. Half human, half something else. Every direction she turned seemed to carry the echo of her own name, spoken by voices not hers, drawing her deeper into the camp's heart. The forest became a labyrinth, familiar paths bending back on themselves, cabins appearing subtly altered from memory, and trails disappearing when she tried to mark them. Her own footsteps were mirrored by unseen ones, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush confirmed that she was being watched, measured, and perhaps guided toward something she could not yet understand. Fear and fascination mingled as she continued, unable to stop following the traces and whispers. The air grew thick with the scent of damp pine and disturbed soil, sharp and metallic in places, clinging to her skin and hair. Every creak of wood, every shifting shadow, suggested a presence at the edge of perception, forms crouching, observing, but never fully revealing themselves. The forest itself had become a character in her journey, breathing and pulsing with life that was neither entirely human nor fully natural. By the time she paused in a small clearing, the diary clutched to her chest. It was clear that the camp was no longer simply abandoned. The forest had absorbed her presence, marked her with invisible attention, and filled the air with voices that both called and warned. The footprints, the whispers, the altered paths, they all hinted at a history of watchers and disappearances, a continuity that reached out to ensnare anyone who returned. She realized with a growing dread that this place remembered her as surely as she remembered it, and that the pines themselves carried knowledge that would not let her leave unclaimed. Night arrived with a sudden weight, swallowing the camp in minutes and leaving the world beneath the pines submerged in an unnatural darkness. The shadows deepened and pooled, stretching across cabins, dirt paths, and fallen logs, becoming dense and almost tangible. Each step she took was measured against the uneven ground, her senses stretched thin by the rustle of branches and the occasional snap of twigs that had no obvious source. The forest pressed inward, the air thick with moisture and a subtle metallic tang that seemed to heighten every sound, every movement, every breath she drew. Faces emerged in the shadows, but when she looked directly, they vanished. The illusion was fleeting, just long enough to imprint recognition onto her mind, twisting memory with fear. A flicker of movement, a dark shape leaning behind a tree, a reflective glint in a shattered window, left her heart hammering. Each glance toward the forest's edge revealed more hints of something watching. Pairs of eyes too still, too deliberate, glinting with intelligence that was both human and impossibly alien. She could feel the weight of their gaze pressing from every direction, guiding her attention, shaping her awareness, manipulating her perception of space and distance. The whispers returned, looping endlessly, repeating fragments of words she almost understood. They wove between the trees, brushing across her ears with a soft insistence that drew her forward. Every path she tried to follow, every clearing she entered, seemed to twist unexpectedly, leading her deeper into the camp instead of out. Familiar cabins appeared subtly altered, doors slightly more ajar, windows shattered in new patterns, shadows shifting in impossible ways. She began to understand that the camp itself had become an active participant, a maze constructed to observe, trap, and bend her experience to its will. Each sound was amplified, the snapping of a branch underfoot, the creak of rotting wood, the low whisper of wind through pine needles. Even the air seemed to pulse with intention, carrying fragments of voices that called her name from places she could not see. Shapes moved just at the periphery of vision, crouching behind broken beams, circling cabins and fading the moment she turned. The forest's attention was omnipresent, patient and deliberate, mapping her every step with a quiet precision that made flight impossible. She stumbled through the familiar yet impossible paths, shadows twisting unnaturally as though the pines themselves were bending reality around her. Lanterns, old and abandoned, flickered with ghostly light in the cabins, casting long, fragmented shadows across walls and floors. Each reflection seemed to contain figures that should not exist, leaning from corners, kneeling just beyond the edges of perception. She realized that the whispers were not just auditory. They guided her, lured her deeper, coaxed her into following the labyrinthine twists that the camp now insisted upon. Her breath came fast, her hands trembling, yet she could not stop moving. Each step seemed to lead her further into disorientation, a cycle of twisting trails and shifting cabins that erased familiarity. The forest had reshaped itself, folding over paths she had once known, folding time and distance in ways that made every return to a clearing or cabin feel like an endless loop. The whispers intensified, overlapping into multiple voices, echoing and layering with a rhythm that seemed both rehearsed and alive. It was as if the pines themselves were speaking, communicating across space and shadow, calling her forward while holding her captive. By the time the night reached its darkest depth, she realized, with a creeping horror, that there was no straightforward path out. The forest had closed in completely, rearranging itself with subtle deliberation, circling her, watching her, and feeding the persistent sense of being surrounded. Faces appeared in corners and behind broken windows, always vanishing when she tried to focus, but leaving a mark on memory. The whispers drew her attention, guided her feet, and forced her deeper into the heart of the camp. Somewhere in the shifting darkness, the forest waited, patient and aware, and she knew that the night had only just begun to claim her. Every attempt to leave the camp led her back to the same cabins, the same cracked windows and ajar doors she had already passed, as if the forest had rearranged itself while she wasn't looking. Trails she once remembered clearly now twisted and looped, defying logic, curving impossibly around familiar landmarks, only to deposit her again in the heart of the camp. The air felt heavier with each step, dense and almost viscous, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth while the faint metallic tang lingered beneath, a constant reminder of some presence she could neither see nor escape. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig seemed timed to her movement, following, observing, and subtly guiding her deeper into the labyrinth. The whispers no longer spoke in single tones, but layered upon each other, overlapping voices that called her name from multiple directions at once. The sound seemed to twist around the trees and fold into the shadows, impossible to locate or avoid. They whispered in fragments, sometimes familiar, sometimes alien, repeating and evolving in cadence, as if the forest itself had learned to manipulate her perception. Each time she tried to focus on one direction or path, another would open subtly ahead, or a familiar cabin would appear slightly altered, doors tilted, windows cracked, casting distorted reflections that made her question the solidity of the world around her. Beneath her feet, she noticed faint handprints pressed into the dirt, small, delicate, almost ethereal, weaving in patterns that mirrored her own steps. They formed a trail she could follow, yet it seemed to twist back upon itself, a loop that led her deeper into the camp rather than out of it. The prints carried the same strange intimacy as the whispers, as if the forest, or something within it, was learning her movements, cataloging her presence, and leaving a silent, persistent signature of its observation. The forest had begun to inscribe her existence onto the ground, mapping her journey with unnatural precision, folding memory and reality into its design. The pines themselves seemed to shift subtly as she passed, their trunks leaning just enough to create corridors that were neither natural nor consistent with the terrain she had walked earlier. Shadows clung to every corner and opening, bending toward her, stretching unnaturally as if alive, and each movement sparked a primal awareness that she was being watched not only by the forest, but by unseen entities inhabiting it. Occasional glimpses revealed forms crouched between trees, far too tall or twisted to be human, moving with a fluidity that made her heartbeat spike. Yet, whenever she attempted to approach, the figures dissolved into darkness, leaving nothing but a lingering unease and the echo of whispers. As dusk approached, the overlapping voices became relentless, layering fragments of her name with unintelligible syllables, guiding her movements and shaping her path without her consent. The handprints continued to appear, sometimes beneath her own, sometimes beside her steps, always present, marking a presence she could neither confront nor comprehend. Every breath she took seemed measured against the unseen attention surrounding her. Even the wind carried intention, bending branches toward her, rustling leaves in patterns that echoed the overlapping rhythm of whispers. By the time darkness fully enveloped the camp, it was clear that the forest had claimed control over her movement. Paths twisted, cabins shifted, and the labyrinth of pines held her captive. She stumbled repeatedly over roots and debris, following traces that led nowhere, hearing voices and seeing fleeting shapes that seemed to mirror her steps. The whispers intensified, overlapping and converging into a chorus that filled the spaces between the trees, an unrelenting insistence that she could not escape. Her own footsteps now echoed with a weight that was not entirely her own. Her body guided, her mind manipulated, as the forest slowly inscribed her presence into its memory. She realized then, with a creeping, suffocating dread, that the camp had transformed into a living trap, a deliberate maze that recorded, watched, and ensnared. Every cabin, every tree, every whisper and shadow was part of it, and she could no longer distinguish between memory and reality. The forest had claimed her attention, her presence, and perhaps a portion of her very self, leaving her caught within the silent, patient web of the pines. By morning, the camp lay in a silence that was impossible to trust. The pines stood still, shadows frozen in place as if holding their breath, and the air was heavy with the lingering scent of damp earth and pine resin. It was eerily undisturbed, untouched by any sign of recent human presence, yet she could feel the weight of the forest pressing in from all sides. Her own footsteps were faint in the dirt, pressed into soft soil that seemed to remember and mirror her movements. The imprint of her passage recorded as though the ground itself had a memory. She froze when she saw it. Her name etched into the dirt, sharp and deliberate, carved with a precision that no human hand could achieve in a single motion. Surrounding it were faint handprints, small and ethereal, forming a path that twisted and wove through the camp, weaving between cabins and around trees before returning to where she stood. It was as if the forest had observed her every move, catalogued her presence, and left a mark, a signature of its claim. Her heart thumped in response to the realization. She had not walked these paths alone, and the forest had ensured that it knew her, remembered her, and recorded her existence. The cabins were quiet, their doors slightly open, their windows reflecting an unbroken forest beyond. Yet she felt that they were no longer merely structures. They were sentinels, cataloging and participating in the hollow's awareness. Every object she remembered from childhood now seemed arranged with subtle intent. Chairs leaned just slightly, books lay askew, and the air itself felt charged with the memory of her steps. The forest, in its strange intelligence, had not only observed her but also reshaped its environment to leave evidence, reminders of its omnipresence, and subtle nudges that she had been here. Paths that had seemed familiar the night before were now confounding. Trails that should have led away twisted back on themselves, returning her repeatedly to the same clearing, the same cabins, the same place where her name was etched in the soil. The whispers persisted, softer now, almost contemplative, weaving around her like a breeze, insistent but patient. She understood then that the forest had absorbed her, incorporated her into its rhythms, and left subtle reminders that she was part of its memory. Each step she took felt heavier, marked by unseen attention, measured against a system she could not comprehend. The light of morning revealed the subtle distortions the darkness had hidden. Shadows lingered in corners that had no logical source. Cabin doors, slightly ajar, reflected glimpses of shapes at impossible angles. Small depressions in the earth hinted at movement beneath the forest floor, movements that had mirrored her own, unseen but undeniably present. It was as if the entire camp, every pine and every patch of soil, had become a living recording device, cataloging her passage, preserving her presence, and waiting to fold it into the hollow's infinite memory. She tried to leave, choosing paths that had once been clear, following the curves of familiar trees, but the forest had already anticipated her steps. Trails looped and converged, leading her past cabins and clearings she had already passed, bringing her once again to the center of the camp where her name and the handprints lay. A profound dread settled in her chest. The forest did not merely contain her. It had claimed her. The boundaries between herself and the wilderness blurred, leaving her aware that she had become a part of its memory, a thread in its ongoing record of those who dared to return. For the first time, she understood the true nature of the whispers, the shadows, and the subtle rearrangements she had noticed. They were not random, not accidental. The forest had documented her passage, recorded her presence, and left the signs for anyone else who might follow. Her own name, etched into the soil, served as both evidence and warning, a mark that this place remembered, that it claimed, and that the pines would preserve every detail of those who walked among them. The paths outward remained uncertain, the forest folded around her, patient and deliberate, and she knew with absolute clarity that it would not release her memory from its grasp.